Who are the Austrians? That's a complicated question, because at a certain point in history, even the Austrians themselves didn't know who they were. But today all these people see themselves as a distinct nation, even though just 100 years ago, most Austrians identified as Germans. So what exactly happened? Let's find out. A quick dive into Austrian history. How Austrian identity was shaped, when Austrians themselves were unsure about who they were, how Austria spent years wanting to unite with Germany, but was literally forced to stay independent by the great powers, and why after centuries of considering themselves part of the German people, Austrians suddenly declared themselves a separate nation. And at the end, we'll take a look at survey results showing how Austrians identified themselves at different points in time. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Let's get started! Let's start from way back. The first humans appeared on the territory of modern-day Austria around 10,000 years ago. People lived here for thousands of years until, in the 4th century BCE, Celtic tribes showed up in the Alps. About 200 years later, the Celtic kingdom of Noricum was established, and not long before the start of our era, the Romans arrived. Around the same time, Germanic tribes began to make their presence known. For centuries, they raided the Roman Empire, devastating it with each new invasion. By the mid-6th century, these lands were fully under Germanic control, specifically the Duchy of Bavaria. Around the year 800, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, established a territory in the Danube Valley known as the Ostmark. By the late 10th century, these lands were first referred to as Österreich. Anyone familiar with German will notice the clear connection to Austria's modern German name, Österreich. In 1156, the Duchy of Austria was established. Its symbol was a red-white-red flag, which Austria still uses today as its official flag. In 1278, the King of Germany, Rudolf I, a member of the Habsburg family, defeated Bohemia and seized the territories of Austria and Styria. 4 years later, he handed these lands over to his sons, Albert I and Rudolf II. This marked the beginning of Habsburg rule in Austria, one of the most recognizable dynasties in European history. Now, let's get one thing straight. The concept of nationality as we know it today, like I'm German, I'm French, or I'm Spanish, didn't really matter for a very long time. What truly mattered back when was whether you came from a noble family or not, and who you were subject to. If, for example, someone from Burgundy in the Middle Ages had said, I'm French, people would have looked at him like he was an idiot. Back then, people said things like, I'm a subject of the Duke of Burgundy, not I'm French. In other words, people identified either with the ruler they served or with the region they lived in. But that's still far from having a national identity. Often people would also define themselves by religion. I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, or by social class. So it was all about allegiance, region, status, or religion, basically. Anything but nationality. Now let's move on. Let's check in on Austria. Oh, here comes Joseph II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Given a serious push to national identity, he came to power in 1765 and immediately started rolling out reforms. As we know, the empire was instantly fragmented, and Joseph hated that. He was determined to eliminate every trace of autonomy and centralize power as much as possible. He wanted a unified bureaucracy that answered directly to the government. This reform made officials and educated people in general start to feel a sense of belonging to the state. Joseph also promoted the German language, making it the official language of the empire. That helped strengthen the sense of identity among the German-speaking population. The same can be said for other ethnic groups, though. Of course, these reforms didn't create Austrian national identity, and that wasn't even their goal. But Joseph did reinforce the feeling of belonging to a country, and that's one of the foundations of national consciousness. By the way, just to clarify, the Austrian Empire still didn't exist at this point. It was technically the Habsburg monarchy, Habsburgs. But in 1804, the Holy Roman Emperor Franz II, in an attempt to counter Napoleon, declared himself Emperor of Austria. So for 2 years he held the titles of both Holy Roman Emperor and Emperor of Austria. But in 1806, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved, and France was left with one title. That marked a big step toward a clearer national identity. The Holy Roman Empire was, to put it bluntly, a hot mess. But the Austrian Empire, now that was a defined, concrete state. After the Napoleonic Wars, the German Confederation was established in place of the Holy Roman Empire, bringing together a bunch of German-speaking countries. But it wasn't created to unite them into one German state. Quite the opposite, actually. In 1866, the Confederation collapsed due to a war between Austria and Prussia, both of which wanted to dominate the German world. Also, after the Napoleonic Wars, Austria started trying to strengthen the hegemony of ethnic Germans within the empire. But there was one problem. Ethnic Germans made up only about a quarter of the population. So, in theory, all the other peoples could gang up, beat the Germans down, and leave the empire. To prevent that, Austria began a policy of Germanization, promoting the German language and culture. Unsurprisingly, this didn't sit well with the other ethnic groups. Eventually, it led to revolution during the Spring of Nations, and that brought Austrians face to face with an unexpected question: who are we really? Let's take it step by step. After the Napoleonic Wars, Austria found itself in deep crisis. One of the most significant developments was the rise of national consciousness. The subject peoples of the empire began to realize Austrians made up only about 20% of the population, yet somehow everyone was expected to obey them without question. On top of that, they were being subjected to Germanization. This realization sparked a wave of national awakening across the peoples of the Austrian Empire. In February 1848, the Spring of Nations swept through Western Europe, and the Austrian Empire was no exception. All the national minorities began demanding freedoms and drafting petitions to send to the emperor in Vienna. Students took to the streets demanding equality. The city's commander, Archduke Albrecht, deployed troops and turned it into massacre. The people of Vienna stormed armories, government buildings and factories and began building barricades. Emperor Ferdinand I was forced to make concessions. The much-hated politician Metternich was forced to resign. Censorship was lifted, a national guard was formed, and the process of drafting a constitution began. But let's not forget, there were other parts of the empire too. In Hungary, revolutionaries seized power. Control was lost over northern Italy, Galicia, Bohemia, Slovakia, Transylvania, the Balkans. Uprisings broke out everywhere. The government had no choice but to concede. Serfdom was abolished, Ferdinand I abdicated, and Joseph I came to the throne, alongside attempts to establish a constitution. But just a couple of years later, things were rolled back, and the various peoples didn't even gain autonomy. Still, the revolution gave a massive boost to the development of national consciousness across the empire. And we Austrians? Well, during the revolution, the idea of unification with Germany started gaining traction. Austrian liberals were enthusiastic supporters of this idea. They saw themselves as part of a single German nation. But Franz Joseph rejected the plan. Austrians split into two camps: those who wanted to unite with Germany and those who wanted Austria to remain independent. This deepened the identity crisis: who exactly are the Austrians? As the Hungarian national movement reached its peak, Austria was transformed into Austro-Hungary. In 1867, ethnic Germans were no longer the undisputed ruling elite. The national awakening of our peoples ended up dragging the Austrians along with it. For example, previously, Austrians didn't refer to themselves as Austrians in a national sense, but suddenly a new term emerged: Deutsche Streicher, German Austrian. You can probably guess what question everyone started asking. Next on the list, World War I. We'll skip over the war itself and jump straight to the collapse of Austria-Hungary, because that's where things get interesting. As Austria-Hungary was falling apart, German-speaking deputies held a meeting and decided to form a new state, the Republic of German Austria. Officials from the German-speaking areas of Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia also took part, refusing to join the newly established Czechoslovakia. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Karl I abdicated. The very next day, on November 12, German Austria officially declared itself a republic. The National Assembly proclaimed that German Austria was a democratic republic, that's Article 1, and that it was part of the German Republic, Article 2. In the provinces of Tyrol and Salzburg, the overwhelming majority of the population, 98 to 99%, voted in favor of unification with Germany, and on November 22nd, the National Assembly officially stated that all German-speaking regions were now subject to German rule. It seemed like that was it. The Austrian nationality was about to disappear for good, but the Allied powers didn't allow the Germans to go through with it. They believed it would be a disaster if two defeated and humiliated countries, Austria and Germany, were to merge. They thought Europe would never recover from it. On September 10, 1919, Chancellor Karl Rainer signed the Treaty of Saint-Germain. Under its terms, the name of the republic was changed from German Austria to simply Austria, and any attempts at unification with Germany were strictly forbidden. And here is the ironic part. While other nations were fighting tooth and nail for their independence, the Austrians were essentially forced to become a sovereign state. In the interwar period, the era of renouncing German identity, Austrians still expressed the desire to join Germany. But when the Nazis came to power, the Austrian government's attitude began to shift. The Reich took a direct course toward Anschluss, essentially what Austrians had long wanted, but Hitler's dictatorship didn't sit well with the southern Germans. In fact, the Nazi party, NSDAP, was banned in Austria. Still, in 1938, through political pressure, the entry of German troops and referendum, Austria became part of Germany, and many ordinary people actually welcomed the annexation with enthusiasm. But when World War II began, Germany conquered much of Europe. and was on its way to taking Moscow. But suddenly, the Red Army began handing the Wehrmacht some serious defeats, and when the Allies joined in, that was a turning point in terms of Austrian national identity. Why does this matter? Here's why. At the Tehran conference, Stalin remarked that while many Germans were being captured, the Austrians often insisted they were Austrians, not Germans, and it was true. Austrians POWs would emphasize their origins in hopes of receiving better treatment, and it often worked. In fact, in 1943, the anti-Allied coalition recognized Austria as the first victim of Nazism, since it had been the first country annexed by Germany. The point of this recognition was the same as after World War I, to prevent Austria from rejoining Germany and further strengthening it. After the war, the Soviet Union supported this idea too, wanting to bring a separated Austria into its own sphere of influence. And when the war ended, denazification, the Nuremberg trials, and so on. For years, Germans were seen across Europe as Nazis and murderers, and naturally, Austrians wanted to distance themselves from that image. The Austrian government declared that the country had been a victim, and Austrians themselves frequently emphasized that they were not Germans. World War II became a key event in shaping Austrian national identity. So here's what we end up with. Before World War II even thought they had their own country, most Austrians still saw themselves as Germans. But after the war, and especially in modern times, if you call an Austrian a German, they really won't like it. Here's some interesting data for you. In 1956, 46% of Austrians identified as Germans. In 1964, only 15%, and according to a 2008 poll, around 90% of Austrians considered themselves a separate nation. So now we have two nations that are very similar, but most likely will never again consider themselves one and the same. And that's all from me. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and write a comment. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.